I shall confine myself to two areas of the India-China border. Firstly, that part of the western sector which lies to the east of the Karakoram Pass. And secondly, the eastern sector, that is the so-called McMahon Line. In other words, I shall exclude that part of the western sector which lies in POK or was handed over to China by Pakistan, the middle sector, and also the Sikkim sector. Of course, in the Sikkim sector, there is an agreed boundary, excepting for a very small stretch. If you look at the map attached to the Constitution of India in 1950, this depicts the boundaries which we inherited from the British Raj. In the eastern sector, the boundary line is shown in accordance with the Simla Conference map of 1914. That is what has come to be known as the McMahon Line. The western sector is depicted with a color wash and the legend "Boundary Undefined" inscribed along the Kwenlun Range. Now, the placement of the legend is at least as significant as its wording. The wording reflected the absence of a comprehensive treaty basis for a boundary alignment, but the color wash and the placement of the legend on the Kwenlun Range indicated the approximate location of the traditional border. From 1954 on, the government of India depicted the entire border with a clear dividing line. That is, both in the western sector, the middle sector, and the eastern sectors. So clearly, the western sector has a more complex history than the eastern sector, and I shall deal with it first. The border between British India and China in this sector came into existence in 1846 as a result of the Anglo-Sikh Wars, the British victory, and the Treaty of Amritsar of 1846. This treaty established the Dogra Kingdom of Jammu and Kashmir and incorporated it into British India. Now, a few years earlier, in 1841 and 42 to be precise, a Dogra army under the celebrated Zorawar Singh had invaded Tibet in an attempt to gain control of the Pashmina and shawl trade, but had been repelled after some early successes. Hostilities were concluded by an 1842 treaty which reaffirmed, I quote, the old established frontiers between Ladakh and Tibet. These frontiers had been affirmed earlier in a 1684 treaty which located the border at the Lari stream close to Demchok, but did not indicate its further alignment to the north or south. With the incorporation of Jammu and Kashmir, British India acquired a new extension of its borders with China's Tibet and Xinjiang. Far from seeking to expand these borders, the Raj was actually concerned with restraining the Dogra Maharaja from repeating his earlier military adventures in Tibet. Here, a word about Britain's China policy will be in order. In China's eastern provinces, Britain followed a predatory policy in order to push its commercial interests. But in China's outlying western areas, that is to say in Xinjiang and Tibet, it was generally supportive of China because it viewed China's claims, China's position in Tibet and Xinjiang as a buffer against an expansionist Russia. And it departed from this policy of extending support to China only in periods when Chinese control over these territories had totally collapsed and when it was therefore unable to play the role of a buffer state. Thus, on gaining control of Jammu and Kashmir, the British explicitly prohibited the Maharaja from further territorial expansion. The Treaty of Amritsar of 1846, which created the Dogra Kingdom, contained a specific clause to this effect. And moreover, it contained another clause, Article 2, which envisaged setting up a boundary commission to identify the border between Ladakh and Tibet in order to ensure that the Maharaja kept within his side of the border. The Chinese and Tibetan authorities were invited to participate in a joint determination of the border, but they gave an evasive response, and it was left to British surveyors to carry out a unilateral survey in 1846 and again in 1847. The instructions given to the commissioners is worth quoting. It said specifically that the commissioners should, and I quote, bear in mind that it is not a strip more or less of barren or even productive territory that we want, but a clear and well-defined boundary, end of quotation. Their task was to establish the boundary as perceived by the local inhabitants in these areas. The boundary commissions of 1846 and 47 thus identified the traditional or customary Ladakh-Tibet border from Spiti up to the Pangong Lake as perceived by the local people and as established by revenue and administrative records. North of the Pangong Lake and the Changchengmo Valley, the situation regarding surveys was far more difficult because here lies a vast stony desert, often referred to as Aksai Chin, though the name properly applies only to the northeastern extremity of this area. This area was infrequently traversed by traders or nomadic herders and had virtually no settled population. Revenue and administrative records were correspondingly sparse, and the identification of the border in this inhospitable region was much more problematical. But by 1865, the indomitable British surveyor Johnson, traveling extensively through Aksai Chin and Xinjiang, was able to produce a map of Ladakh's northern border with Tibet and Xinjiang. The Johnson map shows the border as lying along the Kwenlun Range, with some refinements introduced from time to time as new evidence became available. The Johnson delineation was the basis of the British India map of 1947. But the Johnson map was by no means the only British depiction of the Ladakh border. In 1899, during a period of great alarm regarding Russia's designs in the Karakoram Knot region, the British made a formal proposal to China of a boundary agreement under which China would give up its tenuous claims to Hansa and would receive in return a boundary running eastward from the Karakoram Pass for about half a degree, and then run south to a little below the 35th degree parallel, and so on. In effect, this would divide the Aksai Chin region between British India and China's Xinjiang and Tibet regions. The Chinese failed to make a specific response to the proposal, which was soon shelved also by the British. But this abortive proposal is worth noticing, if only because it illustrates that an imperial power is apt to sacrifice a traditional boundary alignment for what it might view at a certain point of time as strategic considerations. This 1899 line, the so-called Macartney-MacDonald line, therefore did not reflect a customary or traditional border. Let us now turn to the eastern sector. As we saw in the western sector, the border is basically a customary or traditional line, supported by treaty provisions of 1684 and 1842. By contrast, the boundary in the eastern sector is primarily based on an international instrument supplemented by custom and tradition. The alignment of the boundary in the eastern sector was, of course, agreed in 1914 at a tripartite conference in Simla between plenipotentiary representatives of British India, Republican China, and Tibet. In the preceding year, that is 1913, Tibet had formally renounced its allegiance to China and had declared its independence. China continued to assert its sovereignty over Tibet, but was compelled to recognize current realities, and it accepted the credentials of the Tibetan plenipotentiary. The principal aim of the Simla Conference was to determine the boundary between inner and outer Tibet, that is, areas under Chinese administration and those under Tibetan control. In the event, the conference resulted in the production of two maps. One showed the boundary between outer and inner Tibet, marked by a blue line, as well as the boundary between outer Tibet and India, marked by a red line. This map was initialed by each of the three plenipotentiaries, but was later rejected by China. It is noteworthy that the stated grounds for rejection, and I'm referring to the Chinese memorandum of 13th June 1914, related principally to the delineation of the boundary between inner and outer Tibet, not the Indian boundary. The second map depicted only the India-Tibet boundary, and it did this in greater detail. Copies of this map were exchanged only between the British and Tibetan plenipotentiaries, together with a formal exchange of letters on 25th March 1914. Now, the India-Tibet boundary in the Simla maps, which has come to be known as the McMahon Line, reflected topography as well as administrative realities. Tibetan administration never extended south of this line, except in the Tawang area. Tawang remained under the control of Tibetan monastic authorities until 1951, when India finally extended its administration to this area. This concludes my presentation of the evolution of British India's boundaries, and let me sum up what I've tried to say. Our boundaries with China in the western and eastern sectors lie mainly in sparsely populated regions, especially in the Aksai Chin region. Historically, governance of such regions tends to be sporadic or even episodic, not continuous. Thus, neither side can advance a totally watertight legal or treaty claim or historical claim to such regions. That having been said, the case advanced by India is much stronger than that advanced by China, and a comparison of the reports prepared by the Indian and Chinese border delegations, respectively in 1960, leaves no doubts in this regard. Thank you.